My therapist was sleeping with my husband and recording our sessions for him. She had a box of tissues on her desk, and she always slid it across to me at the exact same moment in every session, like she'd rehearsed it. For 3 years I thought that meant she understood me. I didn't know she was timing it. I didn't know she was taking notes for an audience of 1, and that audience was sleeping in my bed every single night. I found out on a Tuesday. I was reaching for a phone charger, not looking for anything, not suspecting anything, and a message lit up a screen that wasn't mine to read. And in 4 seconds, every single thing I believed about my marriage and my own healing turned to ash in my hands. Let me take you back, because you need to understand how deep this went before I tell you how far I went to end it. My name doesn't matter for this story. What matters is a man I'll call Daniel, and a woman I'll call Dr. Whitfield, and 3 years of my life that I handed to both of them without ever once suspecting they were building something behind my back that had nothing to do with helping me. Daniel and I got married 6 years ago. He was the kind of charming that makes a room tilt slightly in his direction without anyone noticing they've leaned. My own sister pulled me aside at the wedding reception, half joking, and told me to hold on to him with both hands, because a man like that doesn't stay uncontested for long. I laughed. I held on with both hands. I didn't know yet that the grip I needed wasn't on him. It was on myself. The first 3 years were good. Not perfect, nobody's marriage is perfect, but good in the ordinary way: Sunday mornings, inside jokes, the specific comfort of falling asleep next to someone whose breathing you know by heart. Then, slowly, so slowly I couldn't have told you the exact week it started, something shifted. He'd disappear for hours at a stretch and call it decompressing. He'd come home distant, then suddenly warm, then distant again, and I learned to read his moods the way sailors read a sky, looking for the smallest change in pressure before the storm hit. And when the storms did hit, during our arguments, he had this uncanny gift. He always knew exactly where to press. He'd bring up things I hadn't said out loud in years: old insecurities, old griefs, the specific shape of my own private shame, and he'd use them with a precision that left me stunned every single time. I remember standing in our kitchen once, genuinely amazed, asking him how he always knew exactly where it hurt. He smiled at me, that easy smile, and said he just paid close attention. I thanked him for that. I actually thanked him. I told my closest friend that my husband was so emotionally intelligent, so tuned in, that most women would give anything for a partner who understood them that deeply. I used those words. Emotionally intelligent. I think about that phrase now and something in my stomach turns over. Around the same time, our marriage started needing more than Sunday mornings could fix, so I did what a tired, hopeful woman does. I found a therapist. Dr. Whitfield's office had soft lamps instead of overhead lighting, a set of framed diplomas that looked expensive, and a voice that poured over you like something warm you didn't know you were craving. From the very first session, I felt like I had found the safest room in the world. I told her things I had never told anyone. The loss I carried quietly and never spoke about with my own mother. The nights I locked myself in the bathroom so Daniel wouldn't hear me cry. The specific childhood memory that made my whole body flinch whenever someone raised their voice near me. Every Thursday at 4 o'clock, I walked into that office and handed over another piece of myself, because that is what you're taught to do in therapy. You trust the room. You trust the woman with the soft lamps and the perfectly timed box of tissues. I trusted that room for 3 years. And here is the detail that still makes my hands shake when I think about it too long. Somewhere in the middle of those 3 years, Daniel got better. Not better as a husband, better at hurting me. Not randomly better, either. Surgically better. He started bringing up the loss I never spoke about, on the exact days it hurt the most, as if he had a calendar circled somewhere. He'd casually reference the miscarriage I had only ever whispered to Dr. Whitfield, dropping it into arguments about something completely unrelated, the way you'd reach into a locked drawer that only you were supposed to have a key to. I told myself he must be more perceptive than I gave him credit for. I told myself that closeness explained it. I did not let myself consider the alternative, because the alternative was too ugly to hold. There was a night, maybe 8 months into the therapy, when Daniel brought up my old fear of being replaced, the one I had confessed to Dr. Whitfield only 2 days earlier in almost those exact words, fear of being replaced. He used it in the middle of an argument about something as small as whose turn it was to call the plumber. I remember standing there thinking, how strange, how eerily precise, that he would land on that exact phrase, that exact fear, at that exact moment. I brushed it off as coincidence, because the alternative required me to distrust the 2 people I had built my entire support system around. Then there was the anniversary of the loss I never spoke about outside that beige office. Daniel brought it up over dinner, gently, almost tenderly, asking if I was doing okay given the date. I remember feeling so touched that he remembered, so moved that he had tracked something I had barely allowed myself to track. I didn't stop to ask how he knew the exact date at all, since it wasn't a date we ever marked on any calendar in our house. I was too busy being grateful. Another time, after a particularly brutal argument, he brought up something from my childhood I had only ever said out loud once, in that office, in a shaking voice, about the specific tone my father used to take right before he raised his voice. Daniel didn't raise his voice at me that night. He didn't need to. He simply matched that exact tone, low and controlled, and watched something in me fold instantly, the way a hand folds a piece of paper along a crease it has learned by heart. I didn't understand, at the time, why that particular tone from my own husband could undo me so completely in seconds. I understand it perfectly now. Looking back now, I can see the shape of it so clearly it almost embarrasses me. Every Thursday, I'd bare my chest in that beige office. And somewhere in the hours after, Daniel would come home slightly too prepared, slightly too aware, slightly too good at aiming for whatever wound was freshest. I built an entire life around 2 people I trusted completely, and neither one of them was who I believed them to be. That was the normal I had constructed for myself, brick by brick, and I didn't know it was built on nothing until the whole structure caught fire in one single Tuesday afternoon. It happened the way these things usually happen, not through some brilliant detective work on my part, but by accident, the universe deciding I had earned the truth whether I was ready for it or not. Daniel left his phone on the kitchen counter while he was in the shower. I wasn't looking for anything. I want to be honest about that, because I know how convenient it sounds in hindsight. I was reaching past his phone for my own charger when the screen lit up with a message preview, and the words on that little glowing rectangle stopped my heart mid-beat. It mentioned the pregnancy I had lost. It said I should bring it up tonight, that it would rattle her. I stood completely still in my own kitchen and forgot how to breathe. For maybe 4 full seconds, I tried to invent an innocent explanation, because that's what the mind does right before the floor disappears, it grabs for any railing, even a fake one. Then I picked up the phone. It wasn't locked. In 6 years, I had never once thought to check, because in 6 years I had never once had a reason to. What I found wasn't just one message. It was a long, unbroken thread stretching back over a year. And buried inside that thread were audio files. Dozens of them. Voice memos with dates attached, dates that matched, one after another, every single Thursday at 4 o'clock for over a year of my life. I pressed play on the first one with hands that weren't quite mine anymore. And I heard my own voice come through that tiny speaker, my own voice, from inside that beige office, saying things I had believed would never leave those 4 walls. And underneath my own voice, layered right on top of it, I could hear the 2 of them talking afterward. Laughing. Actually laughing, easy and warm, like old friends comparing notes. I heard Dr. Whitfield's honey-smooth voice, the same voice that used to slide a tissue box toward me at exactly the right second, saying that I really believed he was the sensitive one, and that it was almost sweet how convinced I was. The kitchen tile was cold against the backs of my legs. I remember that detail more clearly than almost anything else from that afternoon, the specific chill of it seeping through my clothes while everything else in my body went numb. Somewhere down the hall, water was still running. Somewhere in my hand, a small glowing screen was quietly rewriting the last 3 years of my life. I sat down on the kitchen floor with his phone still in my hand and I did not cry. I need you to understand that, because it surprised me too. Something in me went very still and very cold instead, the way a lake freezes over in a single overnight drop in temperature, smooth on the surface, and something entirely different underneath. There was a second recording, and in it I heard Dr. Whitfield's voice explaining, almost clinically, the exact childhood pattern behind my flinch reflex, the one tied to my father's tone, and I heard her tell Daniel, word for word, how to reproduce that tone so precisely that it would bypass every defense I had. I heard her call it, and I will never forget this phrase, a shortcut. A shortcut into me. As if the years I had spent quietly surviving something painful were nothing more than a piece of code someone had cracked open for convenience. There was a third recording where I heard my own voice, small and trembling, describing the loss I had never told my own mother about. And less than a minute later, layered right on top of it, I heard Daniel's voice, already planning which dinner conversation he'd bring it up in for maximum effect. I remember staring at the ceiling of my own kitchen and thinking, with a strange, detached kind of clarity, that I had spent 3 years paying someone to help me build a stronger version of myself, and instead she had spent 3 years handing my blueprints to the one person who wanted to see me collapse. I listened to 11 of those recordings before the shower shut off down the hall. 11. More than a year of my most private hours, condensed into material for someone else's benefit. Every fear I had ever whispered to Dr. Whitfield in confidence had apparently been handed straight to my husband like a briefing document, and he had been using it against me, piece by piece, for longer than I could bear to calculate. My grief. My old shame. The exact sentence that made my chest cave in when I heard it out loud. He had a file on my inner life, and I had been living inside a marriage where every soft spot I owned was mapped out for someone else's convenience. When Daniel walked back into the kitchen with a towel around his waist and saw me sitting there holding his phone, his face did something I will remember for the rest of my life. It wasn't shame that crossed his features first. It was calculation. I watched him actually calculate, in real time, which version of himself he needed to perform to get out of this room intact. I didn't scream. I wish I could tell you I screamed, because that would be the satisfying version of this story, the version that plays well in your head when you imagine finding out something like this. But the truth is quieter and colder than that. I asked him one question, very softly. How long? He tried the gentle voice first, the one he used whenever he needed something from me. He started with baby, it's not what you think, and I felt something in my chest curl up tight and refuse to open again. I asked him a second time, no softer than the first. How long, Daniel? 14 months. 14 months of Thursday sessions where I opened my chest to a woman who was already sharing a bed with the man I was desperately trying to save my marriage for. 14 months of him occasionally sitting in that waiting room afterward, she admitted to him, just to talk through what she'd heard before I had even left the parking lot. He tried, briefly, to make it about me. He said something about how distant I had become over the years, how he had needed to talk to someone too, how one thing had simply led to another the way these things sometimes do. I let him talk. I let him build his entire defense in real time, standing in our kitchen in a towel, dripping onto the floor we had picked out together 4 years earlier. And when he was finished, when he had run out of soft words to reach for, I asked him a question I already knew the answer to, just to watch whether he'd have the nerve to lie about it directly to my face. I asked if Dr. Whitfield had ever once, in 3 years, actually tried to help me. He hesitated a half-second too long before saying that in her way, she probably had. I remember laughing, one short, humorless sound, because that hesitation told me everything the recordings hadn't already confirmed. Even he didn't fully believe what he was saying. I want to walk you through what happened next slowly, because the fast version doesn't do it justice, and because if you've ever been in a position like this, I think the details matter. I did not file for anything quietly. I know quiet dignity sounds like the noble choice, the high road, the thing people admire in hindsight. But the truth is that quiet dignity is a lovely idea that tends to die the moment you're actually holding proof in your own two hands. Before I said another word to Daniel, before I let myself feel a single emotion beyond that strange cold stillness, I copied everything. Every recording. Every message. Timestamped, backed up in 3 separate places, because I had learned, in the span of about 10 minutes, that people like Daniel and people like Dr. Whitfield only respect what they cannot make disappear. Then I did something that surprised even me. I sat down at my kitchen table that same night, still in the clothes I'd worn all day, and I began writing a formal complaint to the state licensing board. Not in a fury of typos and misplaced anger, though the anger was absolutely there, sitting behind my ribs like a second heartbeat. I wrote it methodically. I organized every recording by date. I cross-referenced every session on my calendar with every voice memo on his phone. I built a folder the way you'd build a case, because I understood, somewhere underneath the shock, that rage without structure just burns itself out and leaves nothing behind but ash and a headline nobody remembers. It takes months for licensing boards to act on something like this. I learned that the hard way, checking my email every few days for what felt like an eternity, refreshing a page that refused to change. I called the board's office once, early on, and asked the woman on the other end of the line how long these investigations usually take. She was kind about it, in the careful, practiced way people are kind when they've delivered the same disappointing answer 1,000 times before. She told me these things move slowly on purpose, because a license is somebody's entire livelihood, and the board has to be certain before they take it away. I understood the logic. I still couldn't stand the waiting. There's a particular kind of restlessness that comes from having done everything right, filed everything correctly, and still having to sit with your hands folded while a system decides, on its own schedule, whether the truth you already know will ever become official. But they do act, eventually, when the evidence is undeniable. Recording a patient's confidential sessions without consent, and sharing the contents with a third party who then used that material against the patient, isn't a gray area. It isn't a technicality some clever lawyer talks their way around. It's the kind of violation that ends a career outright. Her license was suspended within weeks of my complaint landing on the right desk, pending a full investigation, and a few months later it was revoked entirely. 14 years of practice, undone, because she believed a locked door and a soothing voice meant no one would ever think to check what happened on the other side of it. Daniel, I handled differently, because Daniel required a different kind of leverage. Here's the thing about a man who prides himself on being the reliable one, the emotionally attuned one, the guy at the office everyone assumes married up, that reputation is essentially the only thing he ever built entirely with his own two hands. So I didn't send him a furious message. I didn't post anything anywhere. I wrote his manager a calm, factual email, laid out with dates and details, no accusations dressed up as opinions, just documentation. How he had used deeply private information, including a loss I had never spoken about publicly, to manipulate not only me, but, as it later came out, at least one coworker he had been quietly maneuvering against for a promotion, using that same cold, precise understanding of exactly what makes a person crumble under pressure. Companies do not love discovering that their golden boy has been running a quiet campaign of manipulation against the people around him, both at home and at the office. He wasn't let go that same week. He was, in the careful language companies use for these situations, restructured out within the month, which means precisely the same outcome dressed in slightly better manners. I told exactly one friend the full story while it was unfolding, a woman I'd known since college who had always been suspicious of how effortlessly charming Daniel could be at every single dinner party we ever hosted. She sat across from me at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd built that folder late into the night, and she asked me if I was scared of what I was about to do. I told her the truth. I wasn't scared of what I was about to do. I was scared of who I would have had to become to keep living quietly inside a lie built specifically to be used against me. That fear, the fear of shrinking myself down to survive in a house rigged against me, was so much larger than any fear of consequences ever could be. There was a strange month, right in the middle of all of it, when nothing seemed to be moving. The licensing board investigation crawled along in silence. Daniel's company hadn't made any decision yet. I went back to work, made dinner, watered the plants, lived an oddly normal-looking life while two separate quiet mechanisms worked in the background to unwind everything Daniel and Dr. Whitfield had spent over a year building. People who haven't lived through something like this always imagine revenge, if you want to call it that, as one dramatic moment. It isn't. It's mostly waiting. It's checking an email inbox with your heart in your throat and finding nothing new for the 11th day in a row. It's learning to let a slow, correct process run its course instead of chasing the satisfaction of a single explosive confrontation. People ask me, when I tell this story, whether I feel any guilt over how far I went. Whether I went too far, whether 2 careers and a marriage were too high a price for what I'd been put through. I sit with that question honestly, because I think it deserves an honest answer, not a tidy little bow tied on top of it for comfort. Here is what I've landed on, after a lot of long nights turning it over. I didn't ruin 2 lives out of spite. I removed 2 sources of harm from circulation. Dr. Whitfield will likely find some other line of work, somewhere far from a therapy license. Daniel will probably find another woman to charm at another wedding reception, and somewhere down the road he may even find another vulnerable person's soft spots to study and use. I couldn't stop the next version of this story from happening to somebody else. But I made absolutely certain it would never happen to me a second time. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that consequence alone healed me, because it didn't, not on its own. What actually healed me was smaller and much slower. It was a new therapist, one I background checked within an inch of her professional life before I ever sat on her couch, who taught me something I now consider close to sacred. The people you trust with your softest, most breakable parts should never be able to reach the people who could hurt you with them. That isn't paranoia. That's just architecture. You do not build the walls of your own house using the same hands that are quietly trying to burn it down around you. The new therapist's office looked almost nothing like Dr. Whitfield's. No soft lamps, no perfectly staged box of tissues waiting at the exact right angle. Just a plain room with a plain couch and a woman who, in our very first session, told me something I had never once heard in 3 years on that other beige couch. She said trust isn't something you hand over all at once at the start of a relationship, professional or otherwise. It's something you extend in small amounts, watch carefully, and only extend further once it's proven itself worth the risk. I sat with that idea for a long time after I left her office that first day, turning it over the way you'd turn over a stone looking for what's underneath. I started noticing, in the months that followed, how many small architectural choices I had simply never made before. I had never asked who else had access to my medical records. I had never wondered what happens to a therapist's notes if a relationship between 2 clients, or a client and someone close to them, happens to overlap in ways it shouldn't. I had trusted the credentials on the wall and the softness of a voice, and I had never once thought to ask what was standing behind either of those things. Now I ask. Now I ask a lot of quiet, careful questions before I hand anyone the softest parts of myself, and I've stopped feeling guilty about how thorough those questions have become. There's a strange kind of clarity that comes after something like this, once the initial cold shock finally thaws. For over a year, I thought my husband's cruelty was some kind of intuition. I told myself, and everyone around me, that it was love paying unusually close attention. It wasn't intuition at all. It was a leak. Someone had drilled a quiet hole straight into the most private room of my life and been siphoning out everything I said in there for their own use. And once I found that leak, I didn't simply patch it and hope for the best. I shut off the water completely, at the source, and I stood back and let both of them watch everything they'd built on top of it run dry, one drop at a time. I think about that beige office sometimes, oddly enough not with rage anymore, just with a strange, distant sort of clarity. I think about the tissue box, always sliding across the table at exactly the right moment. I used to think that timing was empathy. Now I understand it was simply practice. She had done that motion so many times, with so many people's private grief, that her hand knew exactly when to move before her heart ever had to. Sometimes, on quiet evenings now, I find myself thinking about the version of me who sat on that beige couch every Thursday at 4 o'clock, so certain she was finally safe. I don't feel embarrassed for her anymore, though I did for a while. She wasn't foolish. She was simply trusting, in a world that occasionally hands trusting people exactly the wrong room to be honest in. I've made my peace with her, the version of me who didn't know yet. I try to picture her sometimes and tell her, quietly, that it wasn't her fault, that the failure belonged entirely to the two people who decided her openness was something to be studied rather than protected. If there's one thing I'd want anyone listening to this to take away, it's this. Trust is not the same thing as safety, even when it feels identical from the inside. You can hand someone your whole chest, cracked open and honest, and still be completely wrong about where that honesty is going to end up. The people closest to your pain are not automatically entitled to it. And if you ever discover that someone has been using the softest parts of you as a tool against you, whether it's a partner, a friend, or someone whose entire profession was supposed to be keeping you safe, you are allowed to respond with more than quiet dignity. You are allowed to build a folder. You are allowed to organize it by date. You are allowed to make sure that what was done to you in the dark cannot survive a single honest look in the light. If someone has ever turned your own vulnerability into a tool dressed up as love, I want to hear about it in the comments below. And if this story found something in you tonight, go ahead and subscribe, because we tell stories exactly like this one every single week, and every one of them is about somebody who finally decided to stop staying quiet.